The topic for today is hypothesis testing and what is confidence interval and the level of significance. And you can see this table. In this table, there are two concepts. One, what is the null hypothesis? It may be true, it may be false. And if we accept it, then there is no problem. And if we reject the true hypothesis, it is called alpha, which is called type 1 error. And in this case, when we accept the null hypothesis, in fact, it is a false, but we are accepting it. It is called beta, type 2 error. So we will understand this concept, no problem. So I start with this slide. And this slide is showing you different type of hypothesis. So it is very, very important that how the hypothesis should be started. Normally, how you can start the hypothesis. So in most of the hypotheses, you can start or you can write that there exists no significant difference between male and female with respect to their performance. There is no significant difference. So this statement is known as hypothesis of difference. Similarly, we can write that there exists no significant association between category 1 and category 2. When we write this kind of statement, we know that we are going to apply the chi-square test. Similarly, if we write that there exists no significant relationship and there exists a significant relationship, so the first one is null hypothesis, second one is alternate hypothesis, and when we write the word relationship, it means we are going to apply correlation test. Then we are using the word impact or influence. So when we use the word impact or influence, it means we are talking about the regression model or the different variety of the regression model. Similarly, all group means are equal. Now, two observations you can feel here. There is a test for each hypothesis. So whenever we frame the hypothesis, we should know which test we are applying to examine this hypothesis. If you are not able to find out the appropriate statistical test in examining the hypothesis, it means that is not a hypothesis. If I say, I will study cost accounting, this is not a hypothesis because it cannot be tested. Similarly, I have seen many statements written by the scholars, and when I ask them that how you are going to test your hypothesis, they are blank. It means if you are not aware about which test is applicable to examine your hypothesis, it means something is wrong. So one conclusion that I'm telling you in the first slide, whenever you mention the hypothesis, you must write the name of the statistical test which can be used to examine that hypothesis. So this is one advice to all of you, and this is for knowledge. Okay, so now I hope you understand this, that without any statistical test, no hypothesis is complete. You must know which statistical test is used to examine this hypothesis. And whenever you are going to frame any hypothesis, you in every hypothesis there are two important words. Number one, the purpose. So I'm going to write here. This is the purpose. Purpose and what is the variable. So in all the hypotheses, purpose and variable should be there, like difference, association, relationship, impact. All group means are equal. So these are the purpose of testing the or framing the hypothesis, and these purpose should be followed by the variables. Like there exists no significant relationship between purchase intention and purchase behavior. So these statement will be complete when you write the name of the variables, right? If you are saying that there exists no significant difference between public sector bank and private sector bank with respect to profitability. It means profitability is the variable, and we are comparing the public sector banks and private sector banks. So every hypothesis have two components. One is which is the purpose, and second component is the variable. Without purpose and variable, no hypothesis is complete. I hope it is clear. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, now the question is there any relationship between the hypothesis and the theory? What is the relationship between the hypothesis and the theory? Actually, because I was teaching some subjects related to finance, so I have heard about some hypotheses. Like the most famous hypothesis that we teach in the behavioral finance is called efficient market hypothesis. Now, one of my student asked me, "Sir, why it is called hypothesis? Why efficient market is a hypothesis? Why efficient market is not a theory?" Right. So similarly, many scholars ask me that what is the difference between the hypothesis and the theory, or is there any relationship between the hypothesis and the theory? So we should understand what is the relationship between the hypothesis and the theory. Okay, my simple answer is that if you examine the hypothesis and find out some result, and when there are so many researchers repeat the same hypothesis and examine that and got the same result. So when slowly and slowly the hypothesis is examined by different researchers and all of them are getting the same result, then this hypothesis will be a theory. This hypothesis will be a theory. So the same hypothesis, if examined by different scholars at different point of time, at different places, and find out the same result, then this hypothesis will be a theory. So hypothesis is the precondition to be a theory, right? But the problem is that you frame some hypothesis, examine it, and you are getting different result. Similarly, some other researchers examine the hypothesis and got the other result. Some other people examine the hypothesis, got the other results. So the hypothesis remain the hypothesis, but will not be a theory. So hypothesis, if examined by different researchers and leads to the same result, then it will be a theory. So in other words, we can say all the theories developed in the research are basically coming from the hypothesis. So you can say in this case, hypothesis is a guess, is a educated guess. Theory, a hypothesis that has been tested many times and has a lot of data supporting it, so it becomes a theory, right? So correct hypothesis and repeated and a scientific theory. Like I'm giving you one example. There is a concept of future market. Government of India studied future trading in commodities as well as in the stock market. Although it is studied almost 20 years back. In stock market, it started 20 years back. In commodity market, it started 15 years back. So there are so many testing of the hypothesis, and different people find different concepts, right? But after that, it is found that the spot market and future market have a long-term relationship. So there is a concept called arbitrage theory, right? So arbitrage theory comes from different testing of the hypothesis. Although in finance there are very less theories, but when you examine the hypothesis again and again and find out the same result, it becomes a theory. Similarly, in marketing, you know that there is a theory of planned action, theory of reasoned action, theory of planned behavior, theory of reasoned action, then TAM theory. So all the theories are coming after testing of the hypothesis again and again, and when same result are coming by all the researchers, then it becomes a theory. So I think now you know that when the hypothesis is examined again and again by the different researchers and they found the same result, it becomes a theory. And if others, different researchers are finding the different results, it may remain the hypothesis. So hypothesis is another name of the theory. Okay. Now, what is a hypothesis? What do we mean by hypothesis? Now, let me explain what is the meaning of the hypothesis. Hypothesis, the bookish language of the hypothesis is this: a hypothesis is a tentative assumption. One thing is very clear, it is an assumption. Hypothesis is an assumption about something. Number one, you have to know it is a assumption, and which the researcher want to verify when required. It is an unproven statement or proposition about a factor or phenomena that is of interest to the researcher. The important role of a hypothesis is to suggest the variables to be included in the research design. If whenever we are interested in finding out the variables, after looking at the hypothesis, we can identify that which are the variables, different variables, which researcher is going to use in the study. And hypothesis comes from two words, hypothesis, right? So hypothesis is the Greek words, and which are from where the word hypothesis came. And hypo means under, thesis means placing. So before testing, whatever assumption you are making is known as hypothesis. A hypothesis is a speculation or a theory based on insufficient evidence which lends to further testing and experimentation. So these are the different definitions given by the different books, but I believe this definition and the hypothesis is a assumption about one or more population parameter, because we are testing the hypothesis on sample study, and whatever result will come from the sample study, we are going to apply on the population. This concept is known as statistical inference. So the hypothesis is always about the population. This is very important concept, that the hypothesis is not on the sample study. The hypothesis is always about the population. Hypothesis is about the population. It is not about the sample. And we examine the hypothesis on the sample, but a result should be applicable on the population. So that's why hypothesis is a claim or assumption about the population parameter. Parameter may be the mean, maybe the relationship, maybe the difference. Like so, population parameter means something which is about the population, and we are finding out with the help of the sample. So this is the definition of hypothesis. And one thing which is very common in all the hypotheses, that they should be statistically tested. They should be empirically tested. If any hypothesis cannot be tested statistically, it is not a hypothesis. So that's why if you think that what hypothesis should have, a hypothesis should always have explain what you are going to what you expect to happen. It's very clear, understandable, be testable. If it is not testable, it is not a hypothesis. Be measurable. You should have some measurable aspect in the hypothesis, means you must have some variable in the hypothesis. Without variable, there is no hypothesis, right? And contain some independent or dependent variable also. As if you consider the hypothesis is always having two type of variables: dependent variable and independent variable. And these independent and independent variable may be nominal, ordinal, or scale, or maybe the mixture of that. So whenever you see any hypothesis in your life, if you have seen, every hypothesis must have two variables, at least two variables, right? At least two variables, and one variable is said to be independent and one variable is said to be dependent, right? And independent variable may be a scale variable, nominal variable. Similarly, a dependent variable may be a scale variable or nominal variable or ordinal variable. But it is a fact that all the hypotheses must have the variables, and these two variables are examined. Maybe you are interested in finding out the difference. Maybe you are interested in finding out the relationship. Maybe you are interested in finding out the impact, right? Or association. But two set of variables should be there. So a hypothesis should have all these things. And if you are not having any data, so this picture I put in the slide because just to tell you, without data, you cannot examine the hypothesis. Because many times the scholars which are from BTech background or science background, they say that we are not having any hypothesis, right? And we don't know what is hypothesis. We never write a paper with a hypothesis. So is hypothesis necessary? So I'm asking that are you going to write a conceptual thesis, or you are going to collect the data? Because if you are not having any data, it means no hypothesis is required. Like if you are doing the exploratory study, or if you are doing the qualitative research, like in these two cases, if you are doing some qualitative research or if you are doing an exploratory study, then hypothesis is not required, right? And but in all other cases, if you are having data, hypothesis is required. So you must understand this, that if you have no data, it cannot be tested and it is not a hypothesis. So for every hypothesis, it simply means for every hypothesis, you must have data. And which data? Quantitative data. So which kind of data is required for a hypothesis? Quantitative. Hypothesis testing is not possible in qualitative data, right? So you must understand this. We require quantitative data to examine a hypothesis. The hypothesis testing is not possible in a qualitative research or an exploratory research. Okay, so hypothesis driven versus need driven work. So I divide the research work into two parts. One is hypothesis driven and second is need driven. For example, all the companies and like for example, if company want to do a research that how can I increase my sales, so this research may not require any hypothesis because they want to satisfy their need, right? So because somebody who is working with a research company like Nielsen or so many companies there are there, even whenever I took the industrial projects, right? So in all these projects, I never took a hypothesis. So I personally divide research projects into two categories: need driven work and hypothesis driven work. Like for example, recently, one of the company gave me the data and they told me their problem and request me that can you identify any solution from the data? The problem which we are facing, can you identify the solution from the data? So I examined the data, I applied the statistical test and give the solution, tentative solution to them. So these research projects I count in the need driven work, not the hypothesis driven work. In hypothesis driven work, we explore the new things. In new need driven work, they know the problem very well and they have the data and their objective is to just provide a solution to the problem. So in industry, they don't believe in hypothesis, but in research, you cannot imagine the research paper without hypothesis. So this is a confusion between different people, that whether hypotheses are required or whether hypotheses are not required. You cannot write a paper without hypothesis, empirical paper without hypothesis, but it may not be compulsory in the need-driven work. Okay, let's move next. Now, type of hypothesis. How many type of hypotheses we have? So we divide the hypothesis into two categories. One is alternate hypothesis and second is null hypothesis. Basically, null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. Now, there is a lot of confusion in the scholars that what is null hypothesis and what is alternate hypothesis. And many scholars say that null hypothesis is a negative hypothesis and alternate hypothesis is a positive hypothesis, right? But actually it is not true. The hypothesis, null hypothesis is not a negative hypothesis. Null hypothesis is actually the neutral hypothesis. So I call null hypothesis as a neutral hypothesis and the alternate hypothesis as when you are challenging the neutral, right? For example, if I say that the sun rises in the east, right? So I'm not making any negative statement or not positive statement. Rather, I am just explaining the concept, the natural aspect, right? If I say male and female are equal, let's say I make a statement that the performance of the male and female are equal. It is not a negative statement. It is just a neutral statement, right? I am saying that the performance is equal, right? But I can also state make a statement similar to it, like there is no difference between the male and female. If I say the performance of male and female is equal, the meaning of the other statement is also same. When I say there is no difference between male and female with respect to the performance, so it means both the statement are exactly same. If I am saying there is no difference, it is not, it does not mean that it is a negative statement. It is a neutral statement. So a null hypothesis is a neutral statement. For example, in this picture, you can see that if I assume that application of biofertilizer, that is a X, do not increase plant growth, it is not a negative statement. It is a neutral statement, right? So we assume that all are same. Everybody is same. Everybody is independent. There is no relationship between them. So, right, these statements are not negative statements. They are neutral statements. And researcher, it is the duty of the researcher to challenge the neutral statements, right? Because on the basis of our observations, we can challenge these neutral statements. And so our objective is to challenge the null hypothesis and want to prove the alternate hypothesis, right? Suppose I assume that the public sector banks and private sector banks are having the same service quality. This is the neutral statement, but I want to challenge it. I am saying that the private sector banks are giving more quality services as compared to private sector bank. So what I'm doing, I'm challenging the neutral statement. So it is a duty of the not a duty, it is the basically job of a researcher that they challenge the neutral aspects to prove that they are not neutral. There is some relationship between them, there is some difference between them, there is some association between them. So one thing which you should understand, that whenever we do the research, the purpose of the research is to challenge the neutral and finding out something significant. So whenever whenever your statistical test found significant results, it means you are rejecting the null hypothesis, right? So what is null hypothesis? Null hypothesis that it is everything is neutral, and we assume everything is same. Everything, there is no relationship between two variables. All are independent. There is no impact of any variable on other variable, right? Because all are independent. So it is called null. Alternate is the opposite of the null. So whenever we say everything is equal, all variables are equal, the alternate is that the variables are not equal. The groups are not equal. Alternate hypothesis is just the opposite of the null. So example, you can see here we assume the null hypothesis that application of biofertilizer X do not increase plant growth. It is null hypothesis. And in alternate hypothesis, we are saying that no, we want to prove that the application of biofertilizer X increases the plant growth. So we are challenging the null and we are proving the alternate. So I hope it is clear. Now I am showing you some of the examples of the null. You just try to read this. Like for example, in the first picture, I'm saying that cat shows no preference for food based on shape. It is a neutral statement. Like plant growth is not affected by light color. Age has no effect on musical ability. So in this case, we assume that everything is independent, everything is same, and there is no impact of anything on other variables. So it is null, but it is not negative, it is neutral. Now, to examine the null hypothesis, uh, basically, if you read this picture, you can have some idea about the null hypothesis. Like I am, what is the default, the status quo? I am already accepted, can only be rejected. The burden of the proof is on the alternative. I am the null hypothesis, right? So basically, the null hypothesis is already accepted. Null hypothesis is already accepted. The job of a researcher is only to reject it. Therefore, whenever you are examining the null hypothesis, we should not write that we are accepting the null hypothesis. अरे null तो accept already हो रखा है, हमें null accept नहीं करना है. Basically, the job of a researcher is to reject it. So whenever you examine the hypothesis, you should write the null hypothesis can be rejected or null hypothesis cannot be rejected. So we should write our conclusion in the form of a rejection, whether we can reject the null hypothesis or we cannot reject the null hypothesis. Right? So some authors say that the null hypothesis failed to reject. Some say that we can reject, fail to reject. So whatever be the language you use in the paper or a thesis, but believe me, you have to write in the form of rejection of the null hypothesis, not in the form of acceptance of the null hypothesis. So we begin with the assumption that null hypothesis is true. By default, it is true because it is neutral. And any difference between the sample statistic and the population parameter is due to the chance and not a real systematic difference. That I will explain, don't worry. So it is similar to the notion of innocent until proven guilty. So testing the null hypothesis is simply innocent until proven guilty. So the person is innocent until he is proved guilty. So this is the sense of testing the null hypothesis. So it may or may not be rejected. We never write the word accepted, although I made this mistakes many times when I was not aware about this concept. But when I read so many books, when I consulted so many authors, then I found that everybody is focusing on the rejection of the null hypothesis. Right? So they never write that we are accepting the null or we are accepting the not accepting the null. Rather, they write that we are rejecting the null or we are not rejecting the null. So a null hypothesis is the neutral statement which we should reject or should not reject in the hypothesis testing. The opposite of null hypothesis is known as alternate hypothesis. Alternate hypothesis is simply the opposite of the null. Right? It is opposite of the null hypothesis. it in alternate hypothesis, we are challenging the status quo. We are challenging the neutral status, and we are saying that the status is not neutral. We are challenging this and want to prove it, right? So we want to prove that there is a significant difference. We want to prove there is a significant relationship. We want to prove that there is a significant impact. So in alternate hypothesis, we want to prove the significant result, and it may or may not be proven, but we try to prove it. Is generally the hypothesis that the researcher is trying to prove. Evidence is always examined with respect to alternate hypothesis, never with respect to null. We never want to prove the null hypothesis. We always want to prove alternate hypothesis, right? So you have not studied any thesis where they want to prove that male and female are equal. अरे वो तो equal होते ही हैं. They are by default equal, right? So you have to prove that the performance or salary or like in medical science, they prove that the hemoglobin of male and female are significantly different, right? So the objective of the researcher is to prove different, significant difference, significant relationship. Basically, we want to accept the alternate hypothesis in the research. And there is a concept called file drawer system. In one of the workshop I explained that. So there is a concept called file drawer system. So I hope you have seen the drawer in the Almira, and you put your garbage there, not garbage, the unnecessary. Basically, there is a concept in the research, and Rothenzel gave this concept, and according to this concept, that all the researchers, whenever they conducted this study, and they found the insignificant results, they put those results into the drawer. So this concept is known as file drawer system. It means whenever you are conducting a study and but you are not able to fail, or you are failed to reject the hypothesis, or you are not rejecting the hypothesis, null hypothesis, you understand that, or you assume that my research is a poor research, it cannot be published because I'm accepting the null hypothesis. In other language, I'm not rejecting the null hypothesis. It means my research is bad, my research is poor, and let it be in the drawer, right? So I hope you understand that the objective of the researcher is only to challenge the null hypothesis and to prove the alternate hypothesis in the research. Okay. So these are the key points that we have discussed up to now, and I just repeat all the points. So in the process of hypothesis testing, the null hypothesis initially is assumed to be true. The data are gathered and examined to determine whether the evidence is strong enough with respect to the alternate hypothesis in order to reject the null. So burden is placed on the researcher to show, using some information, sample information, that null hypothesis is false, so we can reject the null hypothesis. If the sample information is sufficient enough in favor of the alternate hypothesis, then null hypothesis is rejected. This is the same as saying if the prosecutor have enough evidence of guilt, then the innocence is rejected. Okay. Now there are some concept of type 1 error and type 2 error that I'm going to study in the coming slides. So this is the points which we have discussed up to now, and I hope they are clear, and we can move to the next